Mis amigos y amigas, bienvenidos a una apertura de mercado. ¿Cómo están el día de hoy? Espero que estén increíblemente. Estamos martes 2 de marzo 2022. ¿Cómo estamos el día de hoy? Estamos aquí viendo lo que es la apertura del mercado. Aquí estamos, nuestro gallito. Yuyuy. Muy buenos días a todos. ¿Cómo se encuentran el día de hoy? Espero que estén súper bien. Aquí estamos en una apertura más. Vamos a ver cómo nos trata el mercado del día de hoy. Aquí estamos aquí la S&P 500 está a 0.55, Dow Jones más 0.65 y el Nasdaq 0.45. Estamos ya en la mitad de la semana, de una semana con muchas dudas, muy volátil. El día de hoy hablará Jerome Powell, mucho ojo, hoy habla Jerome Powell. Vamos a ver qué es lo que nos indica y vamos a comenzar aquí viendo lo que está pasando. Seguimos aquí viendo lo que son el conflicto de Rusia y Ucrania. Vamos a hablar un poquito del tema. También lo que dijo Joe Biden el día de ayer, ciertos puntos. Algunas empresas que sí la veo a las alza. En realidad vamos a estar hablando sobre el tema, ¿verdad? Ford, vamos a hablar un poquito de Ford, de lo que diga lo que es el Jerome Powell el día de hoy. Y vamos a estar viendo lo que está pasando. Los futuros de índices son positivos a medida que la intensificación de la guerra de Ucrania empuja los precios del petróleo a la alza. Entonces, vamos a estar viendo todo esto el día de hoy. Aquí estamos en una apertura más y veamos lo que está pasando. Sophie Technology 12.58, Roku 134.43, Palantir 11.90, Nvidia 237.19, Sandow Growers 0.50, Twitter 35.26, Pinterest 26.08, Snap 37.32, Amazon 3000, Meta Platform 203, ExxonMobil está 80.71, Alphabet 2665, Arrival 3452, Netflix 385, Microsoft 394, Castor Maritim 1.62, Ford Motors 17.51, un 4%, eso es todo. EVGO Inc 10.15, Casco está 520, Chewy 45.64, Digital World 97.56, Coinbase 192.07, ChargePoint está 14.22, Aurora Innovation 5.37, Bank of America 42.82, DocuSign 112.04, Excel Technology 0.63, Society Pass 214, Walt Disney 146.63, PayPal 104.92, Wynn Resort 85.99, Lemonade 24.12, Himax Technology 11.03, Boeing 198.69, Robinhood 11.50, Zoom Video 119.05, Best Inc. 0.69, Astra Space 3.35, DraftKings 23.53, Foot Locker 29.78, Zona Group 4.80, Progenery 1.25, Macy's 25.03, Alibaba 105.60, Uber Technology 33.64, Carnival 19.37, Rivian 57.70, Camber Energy .62, Lowe's 222, Target 219.67, Indiva .29, Home Depot está en 320.62, Tattoo Chef 12.64, AMC 18.06. ¿Qué está pasando? Espero que agarramos fuerzas. Se está desplomando un poquito. No, hombre, vamos a que agarre energías. AMC. Yo le hice aquí iba a la alta, pero lo bueno que le dimos unos días más, ok, le hicimos a lo que es una semana. Vamos a ver aquí, Virgin Galactic 9.34, ok, eso es todo, eso es Virgin, Microsoft, ok, 1.49, NIO 21.67, Pfizer 4.411, Moderna 147.78, Johnson Johnson 164.89, Tesla 870.98. Aquí estamos viendo Apple 163.38, GameStop 119.71, Roblox 49.02. Warhorse Group 3.55. Vamos a ver aquí. Lucid 24.41, ya perdiendo un 2%. Y Wish, ahí estamos, ya que siga cayendo porque también la tenemos a la baja. Pero ya perdiendo 9%, ya se va cocinando el arrocito. Ahí vamos lentamente. Vamos a ver aquí, mis amigos y amigas. Ahora vamos a ver cómo están las criptomonedas el día de hoy. Aquí estamos. Vamos a ver aquí. Aurora todavía tenemos aquí. Virgin Galactic. Ok, ya está agarrando un repunte. Vamos a ver. Aunque ya pues en nuestro club VIP indiqué el movimiento que pienso hacer con Virgin Galactic. Si no se han unido a nuestro club VIP, únanse. Ahí estoy, pues quiero o no, nos juntamos el día de ayer en los earnings. Entonces ahí nos juntamos en los earnings en vez en cuando. También pongo ahí mis análisis, estudios, lo que vi, lo que fue en la conferencia de ayer, lo que habló el presidente, todo esto pues aquí lo comparto. Pues únanse a nuestro club VIP, están bienvenidos. Aquí están los links siempre en lo que es en la descripción del video, tengo el link, o si no pueden visitar a nuestra página oficial mariomartinez.com y ahí encontrarán el link aquí donde dice únete a nuestro club VIP. Ahora aquí tenemos ya ciertos movimientos que estamos haciendo lo que es esta semana. Aquí estamos, vamos a ver aquí. Entonces aquí estamos viendo, si ya indiqué cuál es el movimiento que le estoy viendo para mover lo que son los sell calls que tengo en Virgin Galactic. Vamos a ver lo que está pasando con las criptomonedas el día de hoy, mis amigos y amigas. Bitcoin 43.479, Ethereum 2.940, Tether $1, BNB 406, USD Coin 99, XRP 0.76, Terra 92.25, Solana 101.13, Cardano 0.94, Avalanche 83.24, Polkadot 18.53, Binance $1, Dogecoin 0.13 y Shiba Inu 25. Están cayendo las criptos, aunque pues lo bueno que tuvieron un pequeñito ralito porque eso les ayudó a que no se desinflaran más, porque sí la estábamos viendo algo como que golpeaditas, pero ya estamos un mejor en ese sentido. Ahora vamos a hablar un poquito de lo que comenzar a hablar, lo que dijo el día de ayer, lo que es vamos a hablar de AMC, porque es muy necesario que hablemos de AMC, ¿ok? Ahora, dijo varios puntos que a mí me gustó de AMC y siento que pues pueda venir a ver a la alza. Eso es lo que siento yo. Ayer hice un video, si no lo han visto, pues aquí está el video. AMC Español podría tener su propia criptomoneda. Yo creo que esto es uno de los conceptos que a mí me interesó mucho de lo que es AMC, ok, ciertos puntos primero que sí piensan tener y están viendo, podemos decir, la manera de crear su propia criptomoneda. Esto a mí me parece muy interesante, muy bueno. Yo creo que estamos hablando que ayer en lo que fue la reunión sí dijeron que de una u otra manera pues todavía siguen lo que son los 400 millones de, podemos decir, dueños de la empresa de AMC. Y esto significa que los retailers siguen teniendo sus acciones, no se han vendido y las han mantenido. Y esto es algo que es increíble, pero a la misma vez es muy bueno. Yo creo que esto era lo que se espera y el movimiento todavía sigue mostrando lo que él dijo, que pues quiera o no, las personas no han vendido. Todavía AMC, podemos decir que los dueños son los retailers. Un 90% de las acciones las tienen y no se han vendido. Ahora, yo en lo personal me parece brillante la idea que quieran venir e incorporar lo que son de una u otra manera las criptomonedas. Pero ahora que ellos quieran hacer su propia criptomoneda, puede ser un movimiento muy bueno y muy inteligente para lo que es, podemos decir, AMC, ¿verdad? Imagínense que creen su propia moneda y pues se vuelva viral. Puede ser muy buena, o sea, comprando la criptomoneda de AMC o sea, o teniendo la acción, igual puede ser muy bueno. Y esto es lo que pienso, ¿verdad? Más con tantos seguidores y tantos miembros, yo miraría un movimiento fuerte en esa criptomoneda. Ahora, aparte, en los NFTs, habló sobre que los NFTs han sido un éxito, ¿verdad? Uno de los NFTs de Spider-Man se fue en $17,000, ¿ok? Ahora imagínense eso, es bastante dinero. Ahora, en lo personal, yo lo veo como un éxito en los NFTs y lo ve de esa misma manera, lo ve lo que es Adam Aaron. Y yo creo que al final de todo lo van a venir y lo van a volver más, ¿cómo decir? Más un negocio. Y esto es lo de habló, que es muy posible que terminen vendiendo lo que son los NFTs, ¿ok? Entonces ahora ya no van a ser tan gratis. Eso en un futuro. No dijo que ya, pero ya lo tienen en la mente de venderlos, ¿verdad? Y esto sería otro ingreso. Tú compras tu boleto y pagas un poco más y recibes tu NFT. Que es muy posible y yo creo que muchas personas pagarán un poco más, ¿verdad? Por ese boleto. Entonces esto es algo que también viene, ¿verdad? Ya estamos hablando de las palomitas de maíz, algo más también que les está agregando en lo que es, pues vamos a decir, a ingresos que pueda ganar de una u otra forma AMC, que esto también es otro punto muy importante de lo que yo vi en los earnings. A mí me gusta estar en los earnings, escucharlos. Estuvimos casi todo el día realmente entre los earnings, entre ver lo que es la conferencia de el presidente, lo que habló en State of the Union, ¿verdad? Y todo esto también lo pusimos en nuestro club VIP. Realmente aquí la información de ciertos puntos que le vi, ¿verdad? Entonces, únanse a nuestro club VIP. Realmente ahí puse un resumen de todo lo que pues ayer estuve viendo. Y pues estos son puntos para movimientos para lo que es el día de hoy. Y movimientos en un futuro, porque habló sobre ciertas empresas, ¿verdad? Que son muy necesarias verlas. Aquí está, únete a nuestro club VIP. Aquí está el link y aquí puede venir, o si no, a nuestra página oficial. Pero sí habló sobre empresas que puedan venir y pues tener un movimiento a la alza. Yo creo que estos son buenas y siempre hay que estar uno viendo estos banderazos de lo que pueda pasar, ¿verdad? Vamos a ver un poquito lo que está pasando en lo que son las noticias, ¿verdad? Vamos a ver un poquito las noticias y después vamos a seguir hablando sobre Jerome Powell. Hoy habla el día de hoy, muy importante lo que diga, entonces vamos a estar aquí viendo lo que está pasando.
Ha señalado historia. No saben nada de la capital ni de su historia, pero tienen la orden de borrar nuestra historia, borrar nuestro país y borrarnos a todos. Volodymyr Zelensky ha condenado el ataque de Rusia al monumento del Holocausto de Babi Yar, adyacente a la torre de televisión de Kiev. El ataque causó la muerte de 5 personas y dejó fuera de servicio algunas emisiones estatales. Mientras tanto, la invasión rusa avanza en otras partes del país. Las Fuerzas Armadas rusas tienen controlado plenamente el centro regional de Jersón. La infraestructura civil, las instalaciones de soporte vital para la población y el transporte urbano funcionan con normalidad. La ciudad no experimenta escasez de alimentos y productos esenciales. Según el portavoz del Ministerio de Defensa de Rusia, 1.502 instalaciones militares de Ucrania han quedado fuera de servicio, pero no apunta a las infraestructuras civiles destruidas. En Zitomir, a 140 kilómetros de Kiev, 4 personas han muerto en los ataques, según la agencia italiana ANSA. Después de que se rompieran las relaciones aéreas entre Rusia y Occidente, ciudadanos de todo el mundo tratan de salir del país. La embajada española recomienda a quienes quieran salir de Rusia que lo hagan lo antes posible, a través de Turquía y otras naciones con las que aún hay conexiones aéreas. Algunos, como la patinadora Sara Hurtado, ya han abandonado su vida en Moscú.
El viajar a cualquier cosa que necesitemos se nos complica, y más que nada por la sensación de seguridad. Creo que vivir en esta ansiedad diaria no es saludable para nadie.
Un amargo final para ella, que se ha acordado de quienes no tendrán opción de escapar si todo empeora.
Ahora mismo se tiene en la cabeza que el ruso es el enemigo, pero no se piensa que también hay mucha gente rusa que no quiere esto. Y yo he tenido el placer de conocerlos y de compartir mi vida con ellos. Y dejar todo eso es lo que duele de verdad y lo que entristece.
Otros españoles, como este abogado, están preocupados porque su visa expira. Cree que Europa debía haber dejado más margen de tiempo.
Creo que las autoridades europeas se han precipitado en la decisión de cerrar el espacio aéreo sin antes hacer un cordón humanitario y evacuar a sus ciudadanos europeos, porque yo soy ciudadano europeo.
Los europeos que se encuentran en Rusia se enfrentan a las mismas dificultades para sacar el dinero de los cajeros que los ciudadanos rusos. Empresas para las que trabajan que tienen dificultades para continuar, los billetes de avión por las nubes o la difícil decisión de asumir que no verán a sus familias en España durante un tiempo.
El debate sobre el posible ingreso en la OTAN llega al Parlamento finlandés. Algo impensable hace apenas unos meses. La agresión rusa a Ucrania ha quebrado la proverbial neutralidad de Finlandia ante la rivalidad entre Rusia y Occidente. El gobierno de Sanna Marin, que anunció hace unos días el envío de armas a Ucrania, matiza, sin embargo, que este debate es sobre todo para conocer la opinión de los partidos. Según las encuestas, los partidarios de la adhesión a la OTAN han subido del 30 al 53% y los detractores han bajado del 43% al 28%. Antes era un poco escéptico con respecto a la OTAN, pero ahora, con lo ocurrido en Ucrania, he cambiado a una posición más favorable a la OTAN, pero tenemos que ver qué pasará. Finlandia es un país occidental, comparte valores democráticos liberales con otros países de la Unión Europea y es natural que la organización que garantiza en gran medida la seguridad de la UE también garantice la seguridad de Finlandia. La guerra en Ucrania ha dinamitado el tabú de la neutralidad y de la pertenencia a la Alianza Atlántica en este país que comparte la frontera exterior de la Unión Europea más larga con Rusia. El fragor de la guerra en Ucrania llega hasta Austria. Su ministra de Defensa, Claudia Tanner, quiere mejorar sus fuerzas armadas con nuevas infraestructuras, como esta base de reclutamiento cerca de Viena, pero también con más ciberdefensas y armamento pesado. Actualmente estamos en 2.710 millones de euros al año, o sea, el presupuesto de defensa más alto de la historia de Austria, pero no nos engañemos, eso no es suficiente para compensar décadas de abandono, dice la ministra. Para Austria, país no alineado, el ingreso en la OTAN ha estado hasta ahora fuera de lugar. De hecho, la eterna neutralidad se celebra como la fiesta nacional de la República Alpina, con desfiles militares que no pueden disimular el bajo presupuesto de defensa de Austria. Países igualmente neutrales como Finlandia y Suecia gastan casi el 1,5% de su Producto Interior Bruto en defensa nacional. Austria, con un 0,6%, gasta menos de la mitad. Irlanda está a la cola con un 0,2%. Equipos obsoletos, pocos repuestos y poco personal. El periodista militar Martin Rosenkrantz informa desde hace décadas de las duras medidas de austeridad del ejército austriaco. Todos los últimos años, cuando Austria quiso comprar armamento, siempre eran armas con el menor poder de ataque militar posible, dice. Para garantizar una mejor capacidad militar, al menos a medio plazo, el gobierno está considerando cuánto debería invertir. La guerra en Ucrania, que está a solo 400 kilómetros de Viena, ha provocado un cambio en la posición de Austria. En lugar de sus tradicionales buenas relaciones con Rusia, la República Alpina se une ahora a los esfuerzos de Occidente, pero está por ver si Austria establece una defensa nacional adecuada y con qué rapidez.
Argentina señala que ya negocia la letra pequeña.
Y esto no es bueno, amigos y amigas. Aquí pues vemos inicios de pues otros países ya prepararse. Y esto, pues quiera o no, no lo queremos ver, es triste verlo, ¿verdad? Pero lo estamos viendo y pues así como lo estamos viendo, también tenemos que prepararnos como inversores. Es muy necesario, ¿verdad? Que estemos siempre con esto. Si llega a seguir incrementando, pues aquí lo estamos viendo. Ahora hablemos un poquito de lo que de una u otra manera pueda pasar el día de hoy con el presidente de la Fed, ¿ok? Señala el impacto últimamente incierto en Ucrania, pero dice que aún se avecinan aumentos de tasas, ¿ok? Ahora, ya con que él comience nublar lo que está pasando en lo que es Ucrania, el presidente de la Fed, yo creo que lo veo como muy buenas noticias en lo personal, ¿ok? Yo creo que están aceptando que pues sí, esto es grande lo que está pasando y puede ser que esto pues lleve a que una u otra manera la Fed no sea tan agresiva, tan fuerte en lo que es la alza de intereses. Ahora, recordémonos que ya por sí, de una u otra manera, lo que es la bolsa de valores ya facturó el peor caso de escenarios en lo que es, podemos decir, ya en la alza de los intereses, ¿ok? Entonces quiere decir que el peor caso de escenario ya está facturado, ya es como que ya estuviera cobrado una alza fuerte, ¿verdad? Más con todo lo que salió Jim Buller hablando y todo, pues ya podemos ver que de una u otra manera ya está facturado. Entonces yo siento que si comenzamos a agarrar, o ya podemos decir alguna señal que sí van a subir los intereses pero bien bajos, yo creo que el mercado puede tener un movimiento positivo, ¿verdad? Esto es lo que yo estoy esperando. Yo por eso ya compartí en nuestro Discord, estoy ya liberando ciertos sell calls, ¿ok? Y a la misma vez protegiéndome a que pueda haber una alza, ¿verdad? Y esto puede pasar. Recordémonos que tenemos que ver ya las banderas y esta es una de ellas. Yo creo que muchos van a estar al pendiente y si ve de una manera más blando la Fed, pues esto puede favorecer a la bolsa. Esto es lo que yo pienso, ¿verdad? El presidente de la Fed, Jerome Powell, dijo el miércoles que todavía va a aumentar las tasas de intereses en los futuros, aunque señala que las amplificaciones para la economía de Estados Unidos son muy inciertas para la guerra de Ucrania. Entonces son ciertos puntos, ¿ok? Entonces sí, estamos claros que sí lo van a subir, pero es muy probable que tomen en consideración que estamos ahorita en lo que es esta guerra, ¿verdad? Y pues al final de todo puede hacer que no sean tan fuertes como se esperaba. Y esto son buenas noticias. Powell calificó el mercado laboral de extremadamente ajustado y dijo que la inflación aumenta muy por encima del objetivo del 2%. Esto ya lo sabemos. Sus comentarios son parte de la aparición obligatoria esta semana ante el comité de la Cámara y el Senado en el Congreso, ¿okay? Entonces es muy posible que esto va a ser lo que ya va a decir. Entonces aquí ya estamos viendo las señales. Yo lo veo positivo, ¿okay? Porque sí va a decir que sí van a considerar lo que está pasando en lo que es Ucrania y es muy posible que sí van a subir los intereses, pero lo van a hacer suavemente. Yo lo veo esto como un catalítico a la alza. Ahora me puedo equivocar, por eso siempre mis amigos y amigas, siempre antes de comprar o vender una acción o criptomoneda, siempre analicen y estudien. Que yo lo estoy haciendo no significa en ningún momento que lo hagan. Yo puedo estar incorrecto. Entonces siempre ahí muy pendientes y muy cuidado. Pero sí, yo creo que esto nos puede ayudar. Ya por sí ya estamos viendo aquí lo que son estas señales que son muy importantes, ¿verdad? Ahora vamos a ver un poquito aquí nuestra posición que tenemos en lo que es Virgin Galactic. Aquí estamos, miren eso, qué bien, qué bien, qué bien. Yo en lo personal me estoy protegiendo. Ok, yo ahorita pues ya di a lo que pensaba hacer con Virgin Galactic. Pienso asegurar, ok, siento que ahorita el mercado está muy volátil, pero puede tener una recuperación muy rápido, ¿verdad? Y en lo personal yo quiero seguir produciendo dinero en lo que es estas acciones, ¿verdad? Les tenemos sell calls y pues ya compartir lo que pienso hacer. Yo en lo personal quiero seguir viniendo y pues a garantizar ciertos dineros. Cuando salen estos dineros se garantizan para después volver a entrar otra vez, ¿verdad? Y ya le puse lo que es mi nuevo price target, ¿ok? Para hacer estos sell calls. Ahora en este momento siempre seguimos con la misma estrategia de los que yo les había hablado, pero yo en lo personal sí tengo un sell call ahorita de lo que es en $10, que un rally positivo puede venir y puede causar que pues quiera o no se tenga que vender la acción. Ahora no está en mis mejores intereses que se haga, claro, no me afecta, como yo les había dicho, no me afecta si se vende, ¿Por qué? Porque esas acciones compré por debajo de los 10. Pero también lo ideal y lo favorecido es no vender, ¿verdad? Sino que sacar ganancias y volver a abrir a otro precio, ¿verdad? Esa es la idea y eso es lo que tratamos de hacer. Entonces, yo ya en nuestro Discord ahí comuniqué qué es lo que pensaba hacer. Hay ciertos movimientos. Aquí están unos movimientos que estoy comunicando. Recuerden, estoy comenzando un portfolio de cero de acciones y criptomonedas. Lo estamos comenzando poco a poco. Voy a comenzar a hacer movimientos más frecuentes y también nos conectamos el día de ayer. Tuvimos los earnings de AMC, entonces tratamos de tener algunos earnings y después de los earnings hablamos. Entonces si les interesa, únanse a nuestro club VIP. Ahí estamos, los links están aquí en la parte de aquí. Ahí puedes ver, únete a nuestro club VIP, lo puedes presionar o si no lo puedes hacer a través de nuestra página oficial marrinmartinez.com, mis amigos y amigas. Entonces, como yo les comentaba, ahorita pues sí, siento que cuando son momentos así, que hay dudas, es bueno venir y pues quiera o no, la que pueda hacer que se vaya, pues quiera o no venir y comprarle y sacar ganancias, ¿verdad? Esto es lo que yo pienso, ¿verdad? En realidad que aunque uno no la quiera vender por parte, pues no está en nada más a sacar ganancias. Uno saca las ganancias y automáticamente podemos decir que después se puede volver a reabrir. Así si ahorita, digamos, la estoy cerrando, estoy garantizando $190 y me quito el peligro que se venda la posición, ¿verdad? Y eso es lo ideal. Aquí estamos. Entonces, aquí estamos. Entonces, realmente es lo ideal y al final de todo aquí lo estamos viendo, ya está produciendo. Recordémonos que con la volatilidad cae, pero al final de todo, con buenas noticias que vengan de Jerome Powell, puede hacer que suba una vez más, ¿verdad? Entonces, mucho ojo. Ahorita estamos aquí, vamos a venir y vamos a comprarla. Vamos a ver aquí, buy, vamos a ver un segundito. Y estamos aquí. Ok, entonces aquí estamos, ya lo hicimos, ya lo mandamos. Entonces aquí vamos a ver aquí. Ya como les digo, garantizamos si sube, vamos a ponerle unas, ya puse a qué precio, ¿verdad? Aquí estamos, ya se fueron, ahí ya no están. Ahora recuerden que ustedes ahí pues en nuestro Discord platico qué es lo que pienso hacer para que tengan una idea. Entonces ahí siempre analicen y estudien, eso sí que yo lo estoy haciendo. A mí me gusta mostrar lo que estoy haciendo, pero no significa en ningún momento que lo hagan, puedo estar incorrecto. Entonces mucho ojo, siempre analicen y estudien, mis amigos y amigas. Pero ahí lo que hice, yo ya garanticé, ¿verdad? Garanticé mi dinero. Ya automáticamente garanticé no vender mis acciones a $10, que sí las tengo raspadas, pero como no ha subido, y garanticé, pues quiero no va a hablar Jerome Powell. Ahora, ¿qué es lo que hago ahorita? Vengo y pues quiero seguir ganando dinero, voy a abrir otros a $11. Los que cerré a 60 los abro a 11 y pues ahí estamos, mis amigos y amigas. Antes es un movimiento corto, realmente estamos generando dinero en donde sea. Eso es todo. Vamos a ver aquí, sigamos viendo lo que son aquí las noticias, viendo qué es lo que está pasando. Es muy necesario que estemos informados realmente. Vamos a ver aquí, todavía no está nada aquí. Ford, ok, vamos a hablar un poquito de Ford. Ford dividirá los vehículos eléctricos y los autos heredados en unas unidades separadas, ya que apunta a impulsar el negocio eléctrico. Miren eso. Ford reconocerá la operación para separar sus negocios de motores eléctricos y sus combustibles internas en unidades separadas dentro de la fábrica de automóviles. La compañía espera que la medida agilice su crecimiento de negocios a vehículos eléctricos y maximice las ganancias. Vamos a participar en todo, dijo el CEO de Ford, Jim Farley, en un comunicado anunciando los cambios. La compañía planea desglosar los resultados de los financieros de las nuevas unidades, así como los negocios Ford para el 2023, brindando a los inversores una mayor transparencia en las operaciones. Okay, muy bien, eso es muy bueno. Yo en lo personal también el presidente habló sobre lo que es Ford. ¿ok? Yo ya pues hicimos un movimiento ahí, lo compartimos en nuestro Discord, nuestro club VIP. Yo creo que de una u otra manera nos dan señales. Yo creo que es muy positivo. Y aquí estamos viendo también estos cambios. Yo creo que Ford quiere ir con todo. Y creo que Ford tiene el tamaño y la experiencia y los años para poder hacerlo, ¿verdad? Y pues nos hemos dado cuenta en décadas. Ya vieron lo que es a Ford versus Ferrari, algo así la película. Bueno, ahí nos muestra que cuando Ford quiere ser competitivo, puede ser competitivo. Y pues puede hacer una película más cuando Ford viene con Tesla. Puede hacer, realmente uno lo sabe, pero en realidad que mucho ojo, ¿verdad? La empresa, mucho ojo. Vamos a ver si salió nuestro movimiento que hicimos en Ford. Perdonen mis amigos, pero aquí yo también trato de hacer movimientos. Cuestan un poquito hacerlos así, pero hay que hacerlos porque aquí ganamos dinero en todos momentos. En todos momentos ganamos dinero. Aquí estamos, ok, muy bien, estamos aquí. Bueno, quiera o no, hubiéramos salido más favorecidos. A saber, está cayendo. Eso es todo, vamos a ver aquí. Seguimos aquí, un fuerte abrazo. Vamos a ver, Ford. Quiero ver si pasó, porque quiera o no, puede hacer que no pasara mi orden. Ok, aquí estamos. Vamos a ver aquí. Vamos a verla una vez más. Vamos a ver. Aquí estamos. Vamos a ver aquí si tiene movimiento. Estamos aquí. A ver si pasa. Aquí estamos. Vamos a ver. Vamos a ver si quiere. Ya estamos aquí. ¿Qué le pasó a Virgin Galactic? Vamos a ver aquí. Vamos a ver Virgin Galactic. Que tal vez hubiera esperado un ratito más. Hubiera esperado un poquito más, puedo decir. Ok. Pero aquí estamos. Se está... quiera o no, Virgin Galactic está cayendo un poquito. Ok, estamos bien. Vamos a ver aquí. Aunque ya entré en positivos en estos sell calls que hice. Ya estaba por sí, estaba positivo. Que pueda tener un regreso. Y siempre hay que verlo. Por lo que sí es que yo ya garanticé lo que les decía yo. Ya garanticé no vender mis posiciones. Ahora lo que sí es que voy a mover aquí. Porque quiera o no me conviene. Vamos a ver, ahí estamos. Hola, aquí estamos mis amigos y amigas, ¿cómo se encuentran el día de hoy? Espero que se encuentren increíblemente bien. Vamos a ver aquí. Vamos a comenzar a saludar a todos los que se han conectado. Vamos a ver cómo están el día de hoy. Un fuerte abrazo. Aquí estamos todos. Vamos a comenzar a saludarlos. ¿Cómo se encuentran? Vamos a ver si hay algo de noticias. Vamos a ver aquí. Vamos a ver un poquito de noticias y después vamos a saludar a todos.
Ahora, entre quienes permanecen en Kiev, algunos viven literalmente en refugios, otros se están movilizando. En general, la población que sigue en Kiev está completamente movilizada y dispuesta a luchar junto al ejército ucraniano.
Rusia está preparada para celebrar una segunda ronda de negociaciones este miércoles. Según el portavoz de la presidencia de Rusia, Dmitry Peskov, en la segunda mitad del día, la delegación rusa estará en el lugar de la reunión esperando a los negociadores ucranianos. En su rueda telefónica diaria ha evitado revelar el lugar de las conversaciones, aunque tras la primera reunión los rusos dijeron que la segunda podría celebrarse en la frontera polaco-bielorrusa. Por su parte, Ucrania ha evitado confirmar que la cita se vaya a dar este miércoles. El presidente ucraniano ha apuntado respecto a ese diálogo que lo primero que se tiene que hacer antes de la negociación es dejar de bombardear a la gente.
Joe Biden promete que Vladimir Putin pagará un precio por invadir Ucrania durante su primer discurso sobre el Estado de la Unión. También prometió salvar la democracia. La economía estadounidense acaparó buena parte de su intervención. Biden habló de políticas para controlar la inflación y de aumentar el salario mínimo, pero la guerra en Ucrania fue la protagonista. El último ataque de Putin contra Ucrania fue premeditado y sin provocación. Rechazó los esfuerzos diplomáticos. Pensó que Occidente y la OTAN no responderían. Y pensó que podría dividirnos aquí en casa, en esta Cámara y en Europa. Putin estaba equivocado. Mientras aplaudía la valentía de Ucrania ante la mirada de su embajadora en Estados Unidos, insistió en que va a perseguir a los oligarcas cuya riqueza ayuda a sostener la economía rusa. El Departamento de Justicia está creando un grupo de trabajo dedicado a perseguir los crímenes de los oligarcas rusos. Nos estamos uniendo a los aliados europeos para encontrar y confiscar sus yates, sus apartamentos de lujo, sus aviones privados. Vamos a por vuestras ganancias ilícitas y esta noche anuncio que nos vamos a unir a nuestros aliados para cerrar el espacio aéreo estadounidense a todos los vuelos rusos. El estallido de la guerra en Europa obligó a Biden a cambiar el guión, aunque con la vista puesta en las elecciones legislativas de noviembre y su caída de popularidad, que ronda el 40%, solo dedicó a Ucrania unos 10 minutos de la hora que duró su discurso para centrarse en temas internos. Su mensaje fue que Estados Unidos está saliendo de la pandemia y quiso transmitir una sensación de confianza económica. Entre sus prioridades, reducir los precios de la energía, los medicamentos y del cuidado de los niños. Estos refugiados están ya en Polonia, pero llegar no ha sido fácil. Muchos describen su desesperada huida de la guerra en Ucrania como un infierno, algo que se complica todavía más para los no ucranianos. Muchos denuncian maltrato y discriminación. Este joven tunecino que estudia medicina en Dnipro describe el trato recibido en la frontera como absolutamente brutal. Asegura haber visto a gente inconsciente, golpeada, incluso muerta. Hay gente que sufre ataques al corazón porque está abarrotado y la gente trata de cruzar. Los soldados ucranianos no han sabido manejar la situación, dice este joven argelino, pero es muy sencillo, no necesitas gritar y golpear a la gente. Usaron electricidad para asustarnos. No era necesario, somos humanos, podemos entenderlo.
En el pueblo este que te decía que era un infierno, ni siquiera pudimos cargar los móviles, estábamos todos sin batería, completamente comunicados, porque queríamos colocar el enchufe y nos decían que no, porque no éramos ucranianos. Nos pedían para subirnos a un autobús hasta 500 euros por cabeza y aún así luego hablaban con los militares y ni aún así, que solo ucranianos, y no sé, sentíamos como que no valíamos nada. Bueno, de hecho era así, no valíamos nada si no éramos ucranianos, no había ningún tipo de ayuda, sino todo obstáculos. Yo llegué a un punto sinceramente que ya hasta quería morir, y era una impotencia de no poder salir de un país en el que no quieres estar y que te lo impidan cuando encima hay guerra, no sé.
Según cifras del Alto Comisionado de la ONU para los Refugiados, cerca de 700.000 personas abandonaron Ucrania en los primeros 5 días de guerra. Más de la mitad han entrado en Polonia. El resto se reparten entre Hungría, Eslovaquia, Moldavia y Rumanía.
La compañía del ballet del Festival de San Petersburgo, de gira por Europa, se solidariza con Ucrania con un...
Bueno, amigos, está pasando mucho alrededor del mundo. Vamos a comenzar a saludar a todos. ¿Cómo están el día de hoy? Espero que estén bien. Aquí estamos en un en vivo más. Estamos aquí al pendiente de lo que diga el Fer. Ok, estamos aquí. Vamos a ver ahí. Un fuerte abrazo a todos. Vamos a transmitirlo. Creo que está pasando desde ya. Ok, vamos a pasarlo. Vamos a pasar un momentito. Vamos a ver un segundito esta noticia y ahorita vamos a pasarnos ahí.
De Letonia, de Polonia, de toda Europa. Somos una familia y estamos en contra de la guerra, decía Irena Veres, directora de este espectáculo de ballet.
All the Europe, and we are a family, and we are against war.
Irena nos mostraba entre bastidores los lazos entre la cultura y la política. El alcalde de Montluçon, con la bandera ucraniana bajo el brazo, hizo entrega de un texto sobre la amistad franco-rusa a la directora del ballet.
Ce soir, c'est un petit peu particulier parce que
esta noche es especial porque se trata de un ballet de San Petersburgo y Y hoy Rusia está en el centro de las noticias, no de las noticias culturales, por desgracia, sino de la actualidad más candente y bélica. Por eso quería transmitir este mensaje de paz y decir que los pueblos ruso y francés siempre han sido amigos y siempre lo serán, y que Europa necesita la paz y encontrar rápidamente una salida a esta situación, decía el alcalde de Montluçon. La cultura y el arte se alzan contra la guerra, igual que este abrazo simbólico entre la soprano ucraniana Lyudmila Monastyrska y la mezzosoprano rusa Ekaterina Gubanova, al final de su interpretación de Aida en el Teatro San Carlo de Nápoles, mientras el público ovacionaba pidiendo paz.
Bueno, amigos, aquí vamos a ver un poquito de lo que está pasando en la Fed. Aquí estamos, vamos a estar aquí.
That is a risk for our economy. We can't let that happen. I was pleased to see the Fed reject the notion of personal accounts by the central bank. As we've seen recently in Canada, and their unprecedented use of emergency powers to freeze hundreds of bank accounts, we need to ask not just how financial authorities can be used, but also how they could potentially be abused. It's disturbing that some Democrats refuse to see this danger and may actually view it as an opportunity to rationalize more government involvement in America's everyday lives. And that's why I sent a letter to regulators today asking for clarity on what this disturbing move that we've seen in Canada.
Aquí estamos viendo lo que Jerome Powell, vamos a ver, ya no tarda de hablar. Aquí estamos ya viendo lo que es aquí en el US House. Ok, vamos a ver cuando hable.
Again, Chair Powell, thank you for being here. These are unprecedented times that you're serving. Thank you for your steady hand and your leadership and your willingness to answer questions using language that most of us can all understand. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member McHenry. I now recognize the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Himes, for 1 minute.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, probably the most effective tool we've deployed against Putin's outrageous attack on Ukraine is the sanctions on the Russian central bank and the freezing of Russian foreign reserves. Our ability to do so stems mostly from the dollar's preeminent position as the world's reserve currency. It is time, in fact, it is past time for all of us to lead on creating a regulatory environment in which we, rather than the world's despots, terrorists, and money launderers, benefit from the emergence of cryptocurrency, including a central bank digital currency. Mr. Chairman, one of the headlines on my news feed this morning reads, "Russians turn to crypto amid increasing sanctions," as the chairwoman indicated. The subcommittee I chair and the full committee have done and will do hard work on this topic, but it is time for all of us to act. Mr. Chairman, I can't shake the image of 17th century bankers sitting around London, unable to imagine that their gold pieces and copper plates could be replaced by these worthless pieces of paper. Let's not be those guys. Let's lead and not follow.
I now recognize the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr, for 1 minute.
Chairman Powell, thank you for being with us today. Inflation has hit a 4-decade high, with CPI surging to 7.5%. Core inflation exceeds 5%. PPI is now pushing 10%. Recently published inflation forecasts predict CPI will rise above 8% in coming months. According to a study from the Wharton School, the average family spent $3,500 more for the same goods and services in 2021 versus 2020. Tax and spend policies are largely to blame. Stephen Ratner, former counsel to the Treasury Secretary under President Obama, put it eloquently in a New York Times op-ed. The $2 trillion American Rescue Plan was, quote, the original sin that, quote, contributed materially to today's inflation levels, unquote. A potent cocktail of excessive government spending creating excess demand combined with a hostile tax and regulatory environment for private enterprise, which has constrained supply, have together produced a toxic supply-demand mismatch pushing prices up. Compounding these fiscal policy mistakes, the Fed pursued for too long an unconventional and overly accommodative monetary policy, which has resulted in an inflation crisis that is hitting our constituents where it hurts. It is clear the Fed is not satisfying its price stability mandate. I look forward to hearing from you on the path forward to address the monetary policy side of this equation. I yield back.
I want to welcome our distinguished witness today, the Honorable Jerome Powell, the Chair Pro Tempore of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. Without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record. Chair Pro Tempore Powell, you are now recognized to present your oral testimony.
Thank you. Chairwoman Waters, Ranking Member McHenry, and other members of the committee, I'm pleased to present the Federal Reserve's semi-annual monetary policy report. Before I begin, let me briefly address Russia's attack on Ukraine. The conflict is causing tremendous hardship for the Ukrainian people. The implications for the U.S. economy are highly uncertain, and we will be monitoring the situation closely. At the Fed, we're strongly committed to achieving the monetary policy goals that Congress has given us: maximum employment and price stability. We pursue these goals based solely on data and objective analysis, and we're committed to doing so in a clear and transparent manner so that the American people and their representatives in Congress understand our policy actions and can hold us accountable. I will review the current economic situation before turning to monetary policy. Economic activity expanded at a robust 5.5% pace last year, reflecting progress on vaccinations and the reopening of the economy, fiscal and monetary policy support, and the healthy financial positions of households and businesses. The rapid spread of the Omicron variant led to some slowing in economic activity early this year, but with cases having declined sharply since mid-January, the slowdown seems to have been brief. The labor market is extremely tight. Payroll employment rose by 6.7 million in 2021, and job gains were again robust in January. The unemployment rate declined substantially over the past year and stood at 4% in January, reaching the median of FOMC participants' estimates of its longer-run normal level. The improvements in labor market conditions have been widespread, including for workers at the lower end of the wage distribution, as well as for African Americans and Hispanics. Labor demand is very strong, and while labor force participation has ticked up, labor supply remains subdued. As a result, employers are having difficulties filling job openings. An unprecedented number of workers are quitting to take new jobs, and wages are rising at their fastest pace in many years. Inflation increased sharply last year and is now running well above our longer-run objective of 2%. Demand is strong, and bottlenecks and supply constraints are limiting how quickly production can respond. These supply disruptions have been larger and longer lasting than anticipated, exacerbated by waves of the virus, and price increases are now spreading to a broader range of goods and services. We understand that high inflation imposes significant hardship, especially on those least able to meet the higher costs of essentials like food, housing, and transportation. We know that the best thing we can do to support a strong labor market is to promote a long expansion, and that is only possible in an environment of price stability. The committee will continue to monitor incoming economic data and will adjust the stance of monetary policy as appropriate to manage risks that could impede the attainment of its goals. The committee's assessments will take into account a wide range of information, including labor market conditions, inflation pressures and inflation expectations, and financial and international developments. We continue to expect inflation to decline over the course of the year as supply constraints ease and demand moderates because of the waning effects of fiscal support and the removal of monetary policy accommodation. But we are attentive to the risks of potential further upward pressure on inflation expectations and inflation itself from a number of factors. We will use our policy tools as appropriate to prevent higher inflation from becoming entrenched, while promoting a sustainable expansion and a strong labor market. Our monetary policy has been adapting to the evolving economic environment, and it will continue to do so. We've phased out our net asset purchases. With inflation well above 2% and a strong labor market, we expect it will be appropriate to raise the target range for the federal funds rate at our meeting later this month. The process of removing policy accommodation in current circumstances will involve both increases in the target range of the federal funds rate and reduction in the size of the Fed's balance sheet. As the FOMC noted in January, the Fed funds rate is our primary means of adjusting the stance of monetary policy. Reducing our balance sheet will commence after the process of raising interest rates has begun and will proceed in a predictable manner, primarily through adjustments to reinvestments. The near-term effects on the U.S. economy of the invasion of Ukraine, the ongoing war with sanctions, and of events yet to come remain highly uncertain. Making appropriate monetary policy in this environment requires a recognition that the economy evolves in unexpected ways. We will need to be nimble in responding to incoming data and the evolving outlook. Maintaining the trust and confidence of the public is essential to our work. Last month, we finalized a comprehensive set of new ethics rules to substantially strengthen the investment restrictions on senior Federal Reserve officials. These new rules will guard against even the appearance of any conflict of interest. They are tough and best in class in government here and around the world. We understand that our actions affect communities, families, and businesses across the country. Everything we do is in service to our public mission. We at the Federal Reserve will do everything we can to achieve our maximum employment and price stability goals. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. Chair Pro Tempore Powell, as you know, the Fed is required to conduct monetary policy in a manner that fulfills its dual mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices. But as you have explained, most of the inflation we're experiencing right now can be traced back to supply chain issues related to the pandemic, and the Fed cannot directly affect supply side conditions. These supply chain constraints seem likely to only significantly increase as Russia invades Ukraine, and the full effect of our sanctions take hold. If the Fed's tools are mostly useful in stimulating or constraining demand, how can we expect monetary policy to rein in inflation that is largely driven by supply-side factors?
Our policies really cannot, as you point out, affect supply-side conditions. Our policies affect demand. What we're facing now is, though, an elevated level of demand in the face of supply-side constraints, and it's the collision of those two things that's creating inflation. So there is an important job for us to move away from these very highly stimulative monetary policy settings to a more normal level of rates and perhaps tighter at a time when inflation is highly elevated, and that is what the committee plans to do.
So it seems clear that the Fed has limited tools to address inflation and that Congress has an important role to play. The Monetary Policy Report notes major shortages in housing supply as a factor in high prices. If Congress were to make investments to alleviate these shortages, do you think this would be helpful in addressing inflation?
Major investments in housing supply? So I think housing prices are high for a number of reasons, actually. Difficulty in getting lots, materials, difficulty in finding workers, very high demand. It's been extraordinarily high. So those are many of the features, and also low interest rates have made credit widely available. Mortgage rates are going up. That will probably begin to cool off demand. I wouldn't want to comment on congressional legislation, but I do think there's no doubt a role for Congress.
So I suppose I could conclude, without having you comment directly on fiscal policy, that you agree there are ways to manage inflation outside of monetary policy. It's not only monetary policy, that others have a role to play.
I do think that's right, but more in a sort of medium or longer term sense. I think the Fed does monetary policy, and inflation is largely a monetary phenomenon, and it's our tools that can be used to address inflation. Over time, though, of course, anything that expands the productive capacity of the United States over time would, in principle, make greater potential output and a less constraining economy.
Fed forecasters expect that inflation will subside as supply chain disruption issues are resolved. However, housing and rent prices, as you've said, account for roughly 1/3 of the consumer price index, and most economists do not expect the problem to be resolved as quickly as supply chain bottlenecks due to both the time it takes to develop housing and the lack of investment in housing that is affordable to low and moderate income families. Currently, there's a shortage of nearly 7 million rental homes that are affordable and available to America's lowest income renters, and a shortage of more than 5 million homes for potential home buyers. In my district, there's a shortage of more than 34,000 rental homes that are affordable and available to the lowest income families, while the state of California has a shortage of more than 962,000 affordable rental homes. If Congress does not make the investments to increase supply and access to the affordable homes in this country, how concerned are you that the Fed will not be able to contain inflation?
Well, you're right that housing inflation is a significant part of the CPI. We also look more prominently at personal consumption, PCE, which is a different measure, and it's something less than that. And unlike these temporary supply-side constraints that we see, housing inflation really is much more of an indicator of the tightness of the economy rather than supply-side problems. So it's something we watch carefully along with wages, frankly, and it is a major contributor to inflation. As I mentioned, higher interest rates housing is a very interest-sensitive sector, and higher interest rates, really interest rates that move back toward a more normal level, should act to cool off the housing market over time.
Thank you. The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. McHenry, who is the ranking member of the committee, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. Chairman Powell, thank you for your leadership in tumultuous times, and this is certainly interesting times internationally, challenged times internationally. Everyone else on the Open Market Committee, it seems, has opined about the March meeting. Everyone, whether it's a tweet or an interview or anything else. What are your thoughts going into the March meeting?
The March meeting. Okay, so here's how I'm thinking about the March meeting. And I guess I would start, of course, with the U.S. economy, which is very strong, the labor market extremely tight, and inflation running well above target. The way we think about our work is we develop working plans for making adjustments to monetary policy over the course of the coming months, and then we are flexible as plans meet the real world. So we're never on autopilot, obviously, and at a time like this, what we aim to do is lay out our principles and then, with whatever clarity we do have, and then proceed to implement those policies carefully and nimbly. So coming into this meeting, let's say before the Ukraine invasion, the committee was set to raise our policy rate, the first of what was to be a series of raises expected for this year. Every meeting was live. Decisions would be based on incoming data and the evolving outlook. I also expected we'd make great progress on our plan to begin to shrink the balance sheet. And so the question now really is how the invasion of Ukraine, the ongoing war, the response from nations around the world, including sanctions, may have changed that expectation. And so it's too soon to say for sure, but for now, I would say that we will proceed carefully along the lines of that plan. The thing is, the economic effects of these events are highly uncertain. So far, we've seen energy prices move up further, and those increases will move through the economy and push up headline inflation, and also they're going to weigh on spending. We're seeing effects on other commodities, and perhaps from declining risk sentiment and weaker growth abroad. The thing is, we can't know how large or persistent those effects will be. That simply depends on events to come. So this is where that leaves me. I do think it will be appropriate to raise our target range for the federal funds rate at the March meeting in a couple of weeks, and I'm inclined to propose and support a 25 basis point rate hike. We're also going to write down our new summary of economic projection, individual forecasts, which will show each participant's views of the path forward in the economy and with rates. I also expect that at this meeting, we'll make good progress toward an agreement on a plan to shrink the balance sheet.
25 veces ya está diciendo aquí lo que esperan subir. Al final de todo voy a venir a reducir todo, mis amigos y amigas. Estamos aquí enfocados en lo que él dice.
As we learn more about the implications of the Ukraine war for the economy. We use our tools to support financial stability and macroeconomic stability. We're going to avoid adding uncertainty to what is already an extraordinarily challenging and uncertain moment. So that's how I would think about it.
Very specific. Now, you mentioned 25 basis points. From all the analysis about what the Fed will do over the course of the next year, is 25 basis points the floor, the ceiling? Is it the speed limit? Is that the max you think the Fed could take on? How do you think of that?
So here's how I think about that. We have an expectation, those of us on the committee have an expectation that inflation will peak and begin to come down this year. And to the extent inflation comes in higher or is more persistently high than that, then we would be prepared to move more aggressively by raising the federal funds rate by more than 25 basis points at a meeting or meetings.
Now, you mentioned the balance sheet, a plan for the balance sheet, and that is to come. But what I'm hearing clearly from you is that the Fed is very interested in financial stability given what's happening, and you're willing to make quick decisions on a question of liquidity, on a question of market stability, those important works that you've focused on as Fed chair. And so this is it's actually substantial news for the House to be the first rather than the Senate to break news. So thank you for your forthcoming, being so forthright about your views on this. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from California, Mr. Vargas, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you for ranking member for holding this hearing. Chairman Powell, thank you very much for being with us here once again. As we look at the unprovoked criminal Russian invasion of Ukraine, one of the most notable national security responses has been the President's recent announcement to cut off much of the Russian financial sector from SWIFT financial services. Our EU partners have also joined us and excluded 7 Russian banks from SWIFT. Chairman Powell, what practical effect would this have on Russia, its economy, its financial sector, and its people?
So thank you. I should point out that the Fed does not impose sanctions on other countries, that we, in this process of developing sanctions, we are not a principal. That's really a job for the administration, particularly the Treasury Department. So we provide technical background support and things like that. But I think questions about sanctions and their effects generally would be more for the administration and the Treasury Secretary. I think you can see, I will just add, though, that the effects of the sanctions so far appear, for now, to have been significant.
Yeah, I mean, we saw what happened to the ruble. We saw what happened to the market. The market's still closed. Is a way around it for them cryptocurrency? Could you talk a little bit about that? I know it's a little bit out of your bailiwick, but as you said, it's an interesting moment in time. You know, we haven't had to face this since really World War II, and even all the comments that you made about inflation and watching the market, so much of it is tied to obviously what the Russians are doing with respect to their unwarranted and criminal act there in Ukraine.
So I don't have any private information on the extent to which that is happening, but that is something you read about and hear about. And I just think it underscores the need really for congressional action on digital finance, including cryptocurrencies. We have this burgeoning industry which has many parts to it, and there isn't in place the kind of regulatory framework that needs to be there. It was probably no different with railroads or telephones or the internet, and ultimately what's needed is a framework, and in particular ways to prevent these unbacked cryptocurrencies from serving as a vehicle for terrorist finance and just general criminal behavior, tax avoidance and the like. So I guess that's what I would say there. I don't really know the extent to which it's happening, although you do hear that and read it in the paper.
Seems like an outform since we did go down this road. Could you comment a little bit about then the central bank digital currency? It seems like that would be something that would be helpful in situations like this.
Yes, so we issued a paper after much thought and many drafts. We issued a paper, was it late last year? I guess it was late last year, seeking public comment on the costs and benefits of a potential central bank digital currency issued by the Federal Reserve here in the United States, digital dollars. And we await, I think we gave an extended comment period, and we very much look forward to reading those comments. This will be something that we invest a fair amount of time and expertise and hiring people and things like that to try to get it right, but also to understand whether the benefits actually outweigh the costs, which I think is an unanswered question both here and around the world. Nonetheless, it's our obligation to move vigorously to understand the answers to that question so that we can deploy a central bank digital currency if it's appropriate. So would it, in principle, it depends on why people are using unbacked digital currencies. If they're using them to evade, visibility and evade the law, then for us just to have a law-abiding CBDC won't change that. They'll still be able to use those currencies for that matter. The existing digital currencies that again are not backed are really vehicles for speculation. They're not used in payments. They're not a store of value. They're speculation like gold. That's what they're used for. Whereas, potentially a U.S. CBDC would have a wider view. I do want to stress we have not decided to do it, but we do understand our obligation is to really get to the bottom and understand both the technical and the policy issues that need to be answered.
Thank you, and I know my time's about up. I'd just say from your lips to God's ears, I hope that the inflation does peak this year and does come down because people are hurting. And thank you very much again for your steady stewardship.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The gentlewoman from Missouri, Mrs. Wagner, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Welcome, Chair Powell. It's good to see you in the chair. We appreciate your time and service. Chair Powell, since the last FOMC meeting in January, the global economy has become markedly more complex. Russia's unprovoked and unwarranted invasion of Ukraine has led to a very steep increase in the price of energy. As of this morning, when I checked, a barrel of crude oil was priced at $112 per barrel. And, this steep increase in the price of energy risk pushing U.S. inflation potentially even higher. How does, and you've touched on it a little bit, but how does the war in Ukraine affect your thinking as you prepare for the next FOMC meeting?
So I think the first thing, again, to say is that the ultimate economic effects of the war and all of the sanctions and events yet to come are just very highly uncertain, and we need to understand that. And so, as I mentioned, I think it's appropriate for us to move ahead. Inflation is high. The committee is too high, and the committee is committed to using our tools to bring it back down to levels of price stability, which is to say 2% inflation. So, but I would also say that given the current situation, we need to move carefully, and we will. And we'll be nimble. We'll be looking at the situation as it evolves. And again, we will use our tools to add to financial stability, not to create uncertainty.
So at this point in time, you don't think that it significantly alters your expectations for the rate increases that you've discussed this year?
I don't think that's knowable yet. I mean, so we've run, what we like to do is run alternative scenarios, and we've done some of that, as you would expect. And it's easy to find cases where it would affect, but we don't know that yet. We honestly don't, and we'll see.
Thank you. Chair Powell, could you explain the role of the Federal Reserve in implementing U.S. sanctions on Russia? How you're working with OFAC, how this actually is implemented? Right,
so sanctions are really designed by the administration. They're part of what the elected government does, where we provide technical support. We implement those sanctions, or we make sure that the banks obey them, that we supervise and regulate. That's one thing that we do. We also consult on, we have knowledge about financial markets and financial institutions, so we're providing technical support, but we're not the decision makers on those things. And honestly, these are decisions that are made at the level of the government, not at the level of the elected government, not at the level of the Fed.
And I know things are happening quickly and in real time here, but what actions has the Fed taken to date since the invasion of Ukraine?
Well, I'd say, first of all, since late last year, we've been on very high alert for cyber attacks. We haven't seen any notable incidents about that yet. We consult. We're making sure that the banks we regulate and supervise are also on high alert. We communicate with the reserve banks where there's a lot of expertise in these areas and other parts of the government. So that's one thing that we've done. We're, as I mentioned, we are in very close contact with the Treasury Department, as you would expect, between every central bank and every finance ministry around the world. But again, we're not the ones who design the sanctions.
Right. Well, cybersecurity is certainly, this committee is, and especially at the Fed, is a top priority. I'm glad that you're watching it closely. Chair Powell, does our U.S. financial system have the necessary capital and liquidity to handle any economic fallout from this war? What kind of data will we be seeing?
I mean, the evidence to me strongly suggests that the answer to that is yes. We just went through a rather enormous shock with the pandemic and the near closure of the global economy, and U.S. banks' capital levels are at multi-decade highs, liquidity levels the same. It's hard for me to look at that and say that a lack of capital is a threat at this point. There are certainly issues. Cyber for private financial institutions is a huge issue, and one that they spend a great deal of time on, as do we.
In 2015, the Obama administration blocked the development of the Keystone XL pipeline, a decision reversed by the Trump administration, and President Biden canceled the permits, again, depriving the U.S. of over 800,000 barrels of oil a day. Wouldn't expanding the supply of oil by 800,000 barrels a day reduce energy inflation and lower prices at the gas pump?
We're not responsible for energy policy. That's a matter for Congress and the administration. Of course, the laws of supply and demand do work.
Laws of supply and demand do work. I've used my time and I yield back.
Gentleman from Guam, Mr. San Nicolas, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. Good morning, Chair Powell. And I'd like to first recognize one of my senators all the way from Guam, Senator James Moylan. Thank you so much for making time to join us here today, Senator. Mr. Chairman, over the course of the uptick of inflation in the last year, you testified before the committee on multiple occasions that the Fed believed that the inflation that the country was experiencing was transitory. And since that time, especially today, there's a seeming change in that tenor. Could you elaborate more on that?
Sure, I'd be glad to. So I think very widely among macroeconomists and other central banks around the world, we looked at it as akin to an energy shock and a supply side shock. And the textbook on monetary policy would have you look through that, because a supply shock comes and goes, and by the time monetary policy is having its effect, which happens with long and variable lags, we think, the supply shock is already gone. So we looked at it that way, and I think we expected to get relief, particularly going into last fall, I would say. We expected when schools reopened, vaccinations, raised, kids back in school. We expected supply of labor to come in, that kind of thing. And it didn't happen. But it didn't happen because the supply side constraints didn't ease. They didn't ease. So it's not like, as a practical matter, what was wrong was not the theory. It was just, in reality, the supply side constraints have been much, much more durable and persistent than we had expected. So we knew that we could be wrong, and I think I always thought we could pivot pretty quickly and catch up. And we did pivot when we started to pivot in the middle of last year, and then pivoted hard at the end of the year. But in the meantime, the economy was really healing incredibly quickly over the second half of last year. Record job growth and record decline in unemployment, record tightening in the labor market. So, we know that what our job is now, which is to move away from these highly accommodative settings to more appropriate settings, given the very hot nature of the labor market and the level of inflation.
There's chatter, Mr. Chairman, public chatter, that the intensity of the inflation that we're dealing with today is a reflection of the Fed not taking policy action soon enough, not taking enough policy action. And there's chatter, public chatter, that causes the Fed's credibility to come into question as to whether or not it is acting responsibly and appropriately with the data sets that are coming in. And I bring this up, Mr. Chairman, because we have a duty to the American people to be able to raise these questions as pointed as they are, and to give individuals such as yourself an opportunity to really speak to the credibility question that's really out there in the community. If you could elaborate further on that.
Sure. It's for others to judge many of the things you mentioned, and we understand that. But so we, starting in December, at our December meeting, we began talking about significantly more rate increases. The market took us very much at our word, and as this year has gone on, the market has so market participants do appear to be reacting, what I would call as appropriately to our assessment, our ongoing assessment and reassessment of what's appropriate. And I'll just assure you and everyone that we are committed to achieving price stability. We will use our tools to achieve price stability. Really, that is an essential bedrock element of everything else we want to achieve in the economy, including a strong labor market.
When we faced the financial crisis in 2008, a lot of lessons were learned about the need for the Fed to be more responsive to the liquidity traps that could take us by surprise. Given the circumstances we're dealing with today and the frustrations that the American people are facing, can you share with us any lessons that the Fed has learned with respect to its responsiveness to the inflation that we've been dealing with over the past 12 to 18 months and the intense inflation that we're dealing with today?
So the inflation that we're experiencing is just nothing like anything we've experienced in decades. It's higher, of course, much higher than anything we've seen since I was much younger. But not only that, it's different. It's coming from the goods sector. The goods sector has been a source of disinflation for a quarter of a century because so many goods, so many manufactured goods have been
But just specifically, Mr. Chairman, reclaiming my time, what specific lessons has the Fed learned from the outcome that we're dealing with today?
Well, I mean, we're still living through it. So the main focus we have is not on doing a retrospective. It's on conducting policy appropriately to return us to price stability while also sustaining the expansion.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Laudermilk, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Chairman Powell, thank you for being here, and congratulations on your nomination to continue your job for a second term. I think it's well-deserved. Before I get to my questions, though, I want to hold up something here. This is a Ukrainian dollar. It's a hryvnia. I kept some of these when I was in Ukraine several years ago doing some ministry work, and I think it's interesting to think that what happens in the next few days may determine whether this is another defunct piece of currency and the nation returns to a ruble, or will this maintain some of its value? But as you look at it, you can see it's a fraction, physically a fraction the size of the US dollar. It takes about 30 of these hryvnias to match a US dollar, but when you look at values, our dollar has decreased in value, as you have mentioned, due to inflation. Now, a year ago when you testified before this committee, I asked what your outlook was for the economy, and you said you expected economic growth to be strong for the rest of 2021. But at that time, I warned that the $2 trillion stimulus bill that was making its way through Congress at that time was unnecessary and far too big, given the economy was already recovering. Lo and behold, these predictions came true. In your opening statement, you mentioned that you didn't expect inflation to continue at the rate it is right now, but I also recall throughout 2021, we heard that inflation was slight, it was going to be temporary, but I also understand that that prediction probably didn't include the actions and the roles that Congress had, as you had said. Now, according to a report from the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, because the American Rescue Plan was so extremely large and was passed when the economy was already recovering, this was a significant contributing factor to inflation. Do you agree with that report from San Francisco's bank that our reckless spending is a contributing factor to our inflation?
I wouldn't like to comment on any particular law, but I'll say this. All of the things that we did after the pandemic were we turned our dials as hard as we could, so did you, with the CARES Act, and the economy did benefit from that. We have the strongest economy in the world now. But, part of that, no doubt part of what we did and what Congress did without naming any particular laws is also part of the reason why inflation is high now.
Right. So there are multiple contributing factors to that, being reckless spending, which devalues our dollar, is one of those. And what we heard last night was that there is not going to be a change in the direction this Congress is going or the White House. It sounds like we're just going to repeat the same mistakes we made in 2021. Now, I know that you have the tools of adjusting the interest rate. You mentioned increasing 25 base points, and you mentioned that it may be necessary to go higher. Understand that. Do you still think that inflation will be temporary? And I believe that you said it would be short-lived going forward because of resolving our supply chain issues. But since there are other contributing factors to that, are you anticipating that Congress or the administration will undo some of the failed policies, such as the spending policies and the suppressing of America's energy supply, which has been a significant contributing factor? Let me rephrase that. If Congress and the White House does not change the policies of 2021 and continues down that same path, do you still believe that inflation will stabilize? Price stabilization will come this year?
Well, first, we've had this expectation, as you all know, for more than a year, and it hasn't actually come true. So we're humble about the fact that we can't really call with any confidence the turn, but it does seem that this year we'll be withdrawing policy accommodation. Actually, a lot of the fiscal policy spending has happened now, and so the impetus to growth will be declining and, in fact, negative from fiscal policy as it stands now. And those are things, and just the natural improvement of supply chains and labor supply and things like that. Those are the things we're looking to for relief on inflation, hoping for. Very difficult to say when they'll happen, and our job is to achieve price stability one way or the other.
Okay. I see I'm running out of time. I've got several other questions, but I'll submit those for the record, and I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Garcia, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member, for this hearing, and thank you to Chair Pro Tempore Powell for joining us. It's been a challenging year. Rising prices at the gas pump and the supermarket cause real distress to working class families like my neighbors in Chicagoland, and improvements in employment and wages are real, but not nearly enough. My constituents saw a decade of stagnation after the last recession. Working class Latinos and immigrants like my neighbors are always hard hit. We simply can't afford that again. Chair Powell, you've said that inflation has been driven by bottlenecks in the supply chain, and last night President Biden highlighted their role in corporate concentration and price increases. I'll note that CEOs from Kimberly-Clark to Tyson Foods have bragged to investors about their power to raise prices without facing competition. And last night, President Biden said, and I quote, "Lower your costs, not your wages." And my constituents were glad to hear that. So, Chairman, can you explain how raising interest rates will lower prices for diapers or chicken? Last time it was because my neighbors lost their jobs and couldn't find diapers or chicken. So is that the idea?
Well, the idea is that right now the federal funds rate is still set close to zero, and that is a very stimulative level. I think it's 8 basis points today. So that is not an appropriate level, we think, going forward. We think it's appropriate that we engage in a series of rate increases over the course of this year and also let our balance sheet shrink. And so what will happen then over time is demand will moderate as interest rates get into the economy over time, and these annual price increases in everything where prices are going up will moderate as well. That is how it has always worked with interest rates. We don't do competition policy, so I can't really comment on that part of it. But I will say that that's how we think about inflation, and that's how we use our tools to get inflation under control.
Changing gears, we discussed corporate concentration, and last July, the president issued an executive order on competition that encouraged the Fed and other regulators to increase scrutiny of bank mergers. It's been a long time since regulators blocked a bank merger, even an acquisition by a globally systemically important bank, or GSIB, in 2020. Chairman Powell, do you think it's appropriate to issue a moratorium on pending mergers while the Fed updates its framework for their review?
Well, I think we have a statute that Congress has passed that gives us the rules for evaluating potential acquisitions and mergers by banks. I think we have a widely developed framework for that work, and we're continuing to implement that. I mean, any changes that would come would either come through legislation or through new personnel at the Fed, neither of which we have right now.
As we learned from Wells Fargo, frontline bank workers are an important resource for regulators. They see firsthand how banks implement or ignore internal controls, and they can identify problems as they develop. Incorporating frontline workers' voices in our banking regulatory system would improve the information we have and diversify the voices that get heard. Chairman Powell, will the Fed commit to adding bank workers to your various advisory councils? Why or why not?
Very interesting question. We do have quite a diverse group of people on our various advisory councils, including people who are representatives of workers. I don't know that I don't know that we have ones that work councils, outside councils that advise us on bank supervision per se, but we do always seek out in all of our reserve bank boards and also the advisory councils that we do have representation from labor and also from people who live and work in and represent the interests of, pardon me, low and moderate income communities.
Thank you. Appreciate it if you would consider that. And Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Kostov, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Chair Powell, for attending this morning. If you can, a lot of times we look for historical references when we try to reference an event, a current event. A number of people, a number of pundits, when they look at inflation today, they reference it back historically to the late 70s and the early 1980s. From your perspective, is that the proper historical reference to what we're experiencing today as it relates to inflation?
That's the proper historical reference for what we're trying not to replicate. So we look back. Obviously, all of us have looked carefully at the history of post-World War II inflation and business cycles and all that kind of thing. One of the things that's different now is that central banks, including the Fed, are very squarely take responsibility for inflation. That was actually not the case in the 1970s. There was a school of thought that really there were certain things that an independent agency just couldn't do because it was too hard and Congress should do it. So now I think central banks around the world have an inflation target. They have transparency so that they can be held to account for it. You know, we're not waiting. We are using our tools now to, and that's really different than it was in the 1970s. So also inflation expectations have been anchored for a long time. They really weren't then. They were allowed to become unanchored. without much of a response. That would not happen in today's world and will not happen.
A few weeks ago when the CPI number came out, I was on my way to a breakfast meeting in Jackson, Tennessee, where I represented one of my constituents and I, when we were talking about the new CPI number, he said, I don't care what the number is, because I know that I'm paying 50% more in gas than I did 12 and 18 months ago. I know I'm paying 20 to 25% more in grocery prices than I did a year ago. I know what the price of a new car and a used car is. If you were me, if you were a member of Congress, what would you tell your constituents about the rising cost, the expensive cost to just live today?
Inflation is too high. We understand that, and we're working on it. It's going to take some time, but we're going to get it back under control. By the way, we're seeing this everywhere in the world. We're seeing it more in the United States because our economy is stronger, but we're seeing it everywhere in the world.
Let me, if I can, follow up on a few questions that some of my colleagues asked about. Ranking Member McHenry asked you about the next meeting and your plans for the next Fed meeting, and I think you eloquently laid it out. But you also talked about the situation that's developed in Russia and Ukraine. My inference from your answer is that if Russia had not invaded Ukraine, that the Fed would be more aggressive as it relates to the balance sheet and to rate hikes. Is that a proper inference?
No, I think that remains to be seen. As I said, we are moving ahead at this meeting. It would be my expectation.
Bueno, mis amigos, aquí estamos. Todavía sigue lo que es la Fed, pero yo me voy a comenzar a despedir ciertos puntos muy importantes. Bueno, que pues están presionando mucho a Jerome Powell para que suba los intereses, pero sí ya nos dio, pues podemos decir, un punto de entrada que son 25 basis point. Esto puedo decir que pues el mercado reaccionó, podemos decir, medio favorable cuando esto sucedió. Okay, nos dimos cuenta de una u otra manera que sí vimos un poco de aire que respiró el mercado cuando esto fue así, aunque sí por ciertos puntos pues dijo que pues todo iba también a ver cómo es que respondía el mercado y la inflación y que era posible que subieran, pero ya por lo menos ya tenemos un dato de cuánto posiblemente comenzarán, y esto podemos ver que lo tomó favorable el mercado, pero al final de todo esto puede cambiar y siempre tenemos que estar preparados como inversores. En realidad es muy necesario, pero aquí ya nos dio un poco de claridad y era lo que pues esperaba. Yo realmente eso era lo que esperaba Jerome Powell. Yo pienso que van a comenzar así y solo de esperar cómo es que la inflación viene y se comporta. Creo que ahí va a ser, creo que el punto de dudas, si en realidad después que suban estos puntos 25 veces, pues el mercado comienza a venir a lo que es la inflación a bajar, ¿verdad? Aparte están hablando mucho de las criptomonedas. Recuérdense que pues se vio en el momento que pueda ser que una u otra manera Rusia protegiera dinero en las criptomonedas, y pues quiera o no, hablando sobre políticas de cómo poder hacer o cambiar que esto pueda suceder en un futuro. Hay muchos cambios que se hablaron. Vamos a estar hablándolo un poquito más en el cierre del mercado. Mientras tanto, yo me despido. Les mando un fuerte abrazo, mis amigos y amigas. Recuérdense que no hay nada imposible, que todo lo pueden hacer si ustedes quieren, y pues nos vemos en lo que es la cierre del mercado, y pues nos vemos, mis amigos y amigas.